This video is going to discuss how to complete the lab assignment named Simple Arrays. As you can see, I already have the user interface set up, so that makes sure that you get that done on your own. I've pretty much have everything under the panel with a title text that just specifies simple arrays. A text with the numbers that will display the numbers generated for an array with 10 elements. Then there's a text to display the total, a text right here to display the average. There is also a count text here that will calculate or determine how many names have been entered out of 4. There's also the name text that will display the names entered in the array. And then there's the button for generating the array, the average button that will calculate the average of the numbers in the array. Total button will calculate the total by just adding all of the elements in the array together, kind of like the sum. There will be a print button that will display the names that have been entered. Only once 4 names have been entered. There's a sort button right here that will sort the names in the array for the different individuals. They will sort that alphabetically. There is a submit button that will be clicked every time the user enters a name. The usual quit button right here to quit the application. And there's an input field to get a name and enter that in the array. So at the beginning, pretty much all of the buttons need to be disabled except for the generate array button and the submit button. Once 4 names have been submitted, the print and sort buttons will then become enabled. And then here, once the array of numbers has been generated, then the buttons for the total and average will be available as well. So that kind of summarizes up a little bit on how to set up the interface and what's the goal of the lab. Let's get started by beginning with the generate array button. So we're going to set up a few things there for this assignment, for this lab. And then the first thing that we need to do is create a new script. So in my assets folder, I've already created the script folder. Make sure you keep your projects organized in that way as well. I'm going to create a C# script, and I'm going to call it game controller. I'm also going to add to the scene, before I forget, an empty game object, and I'm going to call it game controller. And I'm going to assign the script to it to make sure that I don't forget. Next, I'm going to start editing the game controller script. There we go, Visual Studio opened up. So let's start working a little bit on our variables that are going to be required for this. We are allowed to use some of the UI. So let's begin with that. We're going to set up some headers for the inspector just to keep things organized and looking neat. So let's add the text for, and of course it's not helping me with the text because I'm forgetting the using Unity Engine.UI. Once I do that, text is recognized. There's going to be the number text. That's the one where I'm going to display the array with the 10 elements. There is going to be a text for the total. So I'm going to call it total text. That makes sense. Then there's going to be a text for the average. Then there's going to be a text for the count. And that's supposed to count the number of names entered between 1, 2, 3, and 4. and I don't want to allow the user to enter more than that. And then there's one more text that will display the names entered once 4 have been entered, and I'm going to call it name text. So those are the texts. I think that summarizes pretty much all of them. Next, we're going to need the buttons, since we're going to enable and disable some of them. We need to make sure we have references for them. So the generate array button does not need to be enabled or disabled, so I'm going to leave it alone. The total button definitely needs to be enabled and disabled, so let's start with this one. We also need to do the same thing with our button for the average. And then we're going to have our buttons for printing. Well, it'll display the names entered by the user. There's also the sort button that will need to be disabled and enabled in our code. And then there's also the submit button. Once we have entered 4 names, we no longer allow the user to enter names, so we need to make sure that we get a reference to that button as well. The last UI element that we're going to need is going to be our input field. There's only one, but we're still going to use the header to keep things organized. So here I need a public reference to it. It's an input field, and I can name it name input field. All right, that's about all that we need. If you have checked on the instructions, we are allowed to have 2 arrays declared up here at the class level. The first one, and they can be private. There's no need to display those or have them accessed outside of the script. There's a number array. And this one, we are told, is going to take 10 elements, so we might as well just define that already. Remember, when you are declaring a variable with an array, it's great, but you only create the array once you specify its size there. Before that, you cannot assign elements or anything to it, so make sure that that's being done. And then the other array that we're going to need is an array of string, and then this is going to be our name array. And this one needs to have a length of 4. And I'm copying here the int, but we need the string there for this one. And finally, the last class level variable that we are allowed to use, at least try to use only these, is the name counter, where we're going to determine how many names have been entered so far. So far, so good. Now let's start working. I'm going to save my work here. And we could actually start initializing all of the UI elements with that script. It will just take a moment, and in this way that's done. So if I select the game controller, now the game controller script should show some public variables to initialize. And I'm just going to assign the different texts and the buttons and input fields to the proper selections, to proper items. Here we are. All of those variables have been initialized now. All I need to do is start actually putting in some code to get some interaction going on. When you declare variables, the first thing that should come to mind is initialization. What values do I want to assign to those variables? For our UI elements, what state do I want those elements to be in at the start of the game? So we're going to initialize some of these items there that we can. Some of them I can set them up to be the empty string, but for now I can just leave them for the text anyway. What I want to do is set up my variables here. Those will be initialized later on. The number array will be initialized by generating random numbers, so that's going to be done by code. The name array will be initialized, or the values of the elements will be initialized once the player or the user enters names. So I don't need to add any information. The name counter, however, that needs to be set to 0 from the beginning. And if I change the value of the name counter, then I should definitely go ahead and change the count text. So I'm trying to display the name of the counter plus and then of 4. I think that's what it looks like in the assignment there. So let's say 0 of 4 entered at the beginning. Now let's work on the buttons. So we've already discussed that the generate array button was going to be available at all times. The total button, on the other hand, does not need to be enabled or interactable until the user has actually generated an array. So let's set its interactable property to false so that we cannot interact with it. Let's do the same with our average button. And the other buttons that we need to consider are going to be the submit button. And the reason for that is that we're going to wait till the user has entered something in that input field. We'll see how we set that up in the update in a little bit. Next is going to be the print button. Set the interactable property to false so that the user cannot click on it. And the last one is the sort button. I need to spell false correctly, otherwise we may have some issues. Let's save our project and take a look at what's happening in the editor once we press the play. And we see that generate array is the only button that's available at this time. Let's work on the functionality for that generate array button to get started with. So for now the setup is good. We're going to have to interact with the rest of it, but let's work on the generate array. So the purpose of the generate array button is to generate numbers to store inside of that number array that we have created. So let's declare that event. We're going to need the update a little later, so let's just keep it for now. I'm going to create the event handler for the generate array button. It won't return anything. But I need to have it called whenever I click on the button. So for this, we could connect it to the button. We'll do that before we test it out. Basically, what we need to do is generate numbers for the array. Our array, if you remember, is a class level variable. So let's declare a function that we'll just call in there. We're going to make it private. It's not going to return anything, and we're going to call it generate array. It's going to actually do the work for us. So To initialize the elements in the array, ideally we want to do a for loop. I'm going to use I for index. I'm going to start at 0. Then the index needs to remain less than the length of the array. Remember, if you have 10 elements in the arrays, the index is going to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 will be the last element, and the length will be 10. So I don't want to go all the way to the length when I iterate through an array. So number array dot length, but not equal, and then I++ to loop through each element. And then I can access each element in the array and assign to it a random value using the random.range. I need to double check here what values we want for that array. Let's declare some numbers between 1 and 10 for now. So I need to pick the values 1 and 11. So that's great, that generates the array. Maybe I'm going to create another function. You were not required to do this, but I'm going to do it because it's kind of useful. This needs to be a private function. It's going to return a string. And then here, display array, I'm going to call it. And basically, it's going to declare a string to display or to return. I'm going to call it here because that makes more sense. And I'm going to set it to the empty string. And then to set the values of the array, I could do, well, let's just do a toReturn here. Let's return the toReturn. This way we have C# at peace, no more red squiggly line. Or maybe it's just me being at peace. So let's do a for each loop, just to show off our new programming skills here. I'm going to loop through the number array. So the number array is an array of integer. So I need to declare an integer. I need to give a name to my iteration variable. I like to use element here because I'm looping through the elements of the array. And then in is the keyword that I need to use next. And then the array that I wish to use, number array, is the one that I'm interested in. Actually, I'm going to change the name of the function to display number array. So far so good. Next, I'm going to increment the toReturn string and add the element that I'm looping through, plus maybe I'm going to put a couple of spaces in between there so that there's a little bit of space between the numbers of the array. There it goes. So that's a pretty good function. It'll just put up all of the elements in the array in one string, and then I return the string. So how do we call these functions in here? Well, when I click on the generate button, I definitely want to generate the array. So my generate array function does not return anything, so I just can call it like this. The next thing that I want to do after I generate the button is actually display the array in my number text. So if I were to just call, before I move on to actually writing the code correctly, if I were to use a display number array right here, the issue with doing this, and I've seen some students do it, so I'm mentioning it here in case you have made that mistake. What happens here is my display number array is figuring out a string and is returning it, but in my calling procedure right here, there is nothing to catch what I have returned. And so it will go into some kind of emptiness there. It won't be referenced by any variables, and then it will be lost forever. So that's not something we want to do. Anytime we're calling a function that returns something, in our example, it's going to be a string. I want to make sure I have something to catch whatever is being returned. In my example here, my display number array is returning a string. Therefore, I need to have a string variable here to catch it. I'm going to call it message. There we goes. So now I have actually caught the string that was returned by my function, and that string needs to be displayed in my number text. There it goes. I didn't really have to have variable. I could have assigned the display number array straight to the number text.text, but this makes it clear and easy to understand. A function that returns something needs to be storing that information into a variable in the calling procedure. In my example here is the generate button click. All right, I think this should work. Let's see if it does. Part of programming is implementing some code and testing it right away. We don't want to wait till we have a page full of it because we could encounter multiple mistakes and it will be difficult to troubleshoot. So let's go back in the editor. If you remember, I did not connect my buttons. So I'm going to do this for my generate button here. I'm going to add from the scene my game controller. I could have just dragged and dropped it. That works just the same. Select the script and I should see on generate button click, which is right there. Now let's press play in our editor and let's click on our generate array, and there goes my wonderful array being generated. I could click on it multiple times and I should get multiple arrays there. It's wonderful. It works. So one of the issues I may realize is once an array has been generated, I should see the total button and the average button become available. So let's work on this portion of the code and then we'll tackle the event for the click of the total button. So I'm going back to my script here and still on my generate button click, I want to enable those two buttons or make them interactable. So there was the total button dot interactable. I can set that now to true. And the same thing goes with my average button. I can set its interactability, I don't know if that's the word, to true there so that it becomes available for me to click on them. Now, evidently, I have not associated any code with these buttons, but if I were to check in the editor and press play, once I have clicked on the generate array button, then my total and average buttons become available. Going back to our script now, we're going to start working on our other buttons. So right below my onGenerate button click, I'm going to define two event handlers. They're not going to return anything because those are going to be called by buttons. I can't really catch anything I'm sending to a button except to tell the button to execute some code or the code to execute when the button is clicked. I'm going to create the functions and then we'll see what we need to add in those. All right, so for these, let's work on the total button. When we're going to click on that button, we are going to basically calculate the total by adding up all of the elements of the array together. Now, if you remember your worksheet 12, you did that before. So let's try and work on this. It's relatively easy. It should not cause any issues. Let's create a function for it. So towards the end of my script, I'm going to create a function. And this function is going to return the sum. So it doesn't need to be public. I only need it in my script here. It's going to return an integer. And I'm going to call call it calculate sum. That can only be used for an array of integers, so it makes sense to call it calculate sum, and it makes sense that it returns an integer. I'm going to return the sum. So first I declare a variable for the sum that I set to 0, and then I return it at the end. So in between here, I need to calculate it. The way I do that is I need to loop through each element in my array. I could use a for each loop. Since I am not changing the individual elements in the array, I could definitely use a for each loop, or I can use a regular for loop as well. It's really up to you. I'm going to use a for each loop. So for each element of the integer data type in the number array, I'm going to do sum plus equals the element. That should add up all of our elements and return that value. Calculate sum becomes really useful for determining the average as well, so it's a good function to create there so we can reuse it in multiple locations. Saves us a little bit of work and typing. So let's call our calculate sum function in our total. So here I'm going to declare another sum variable, and I'm going to call my calculate sum function here. Remember, if I call a function that has a return, I need to make sure I have a variable to catch that return. So here, that's why I declared an integer variable called sum, and then I call my function. It will return that value, and then I can display it. So the display needs to be happening in the total text, .text, and I can just do sum.toString here, same as we've seen before. Nothing too new or fancy here. Let's try it and see if it works as expected. So I click on generate array, and then I have some values that are displaying. And when I click on my total, it's not working, which makes total sense because it's getting late and I forgot to connect my total button with the function. So let's make sure we come off play mode, select the total button here, and then get to the inspector to the on-click portion. Select as a game object from the scene the game controller, and then from that game controller select the game controller script and then the on total button click. So now if I were to test it and generate an array, this one might actually be a little easier. 20, 30, 44 seems about right. I could generate another array and then recalculate the total and get a different value there. It seems to be working as expected. The next button that we need to handle is the average. So let's go back to our script and let's work on our average button click. So we've so far calculated the sum. That can be something useful. What I would like to do now is calculate the average of the elements in the array. So I can declare a private function again. It's going to return, I don't want to return an integer, I want to return a float because I'm going to get a value and then it's 10 of them, so chances are I'm going to get one decimal value, so I want to return a float. Maybe I'm going to call this calculate average. That's great. So what we're going to do here is declare a float. We're going to call it average. And then we're going to set it to 0 for now. And then we're going to return average. Just so that we remove the red squiggly line. So in between, I need to calculate the value of the average. Well, it's very simple. I need to have the sum of the elements divided by however many I have. The sum of the element, that's pretty simple. That's calculate sum. But that returns an integer. So if I were to keep it like this and do something like average equals calculate sum divided by, well, I could use 10, but that's kind of bad practice to use hard-coded values. So I'm going to use number array.length. There it goes. So if I return the average, now let's go back up to our event for the average button. I'm going to declare float that I need to spell correctly. And then I'm going to call it average or AVG, that works as well. And I'm going to call calculate, not sum, but calculate average. And then I can display that and see what happens. So that's the text, average text. There it is, dot text. So this is not going to give me exactly what I want, but for now, let's just play along and see what we're going to get, and then I'll give you a solution. One solution. There's several ways you can handle this. So we're going back to the editor. Let's make sure we're connecting our average button. And like the total button, it'd be nice not to have to go through that process again of forgetting. And then in the game controller, make sure I select my on average button. Click. So if I press play, obviously I'm going to have to generate the array first. Can calculate the total, that kind of helps me out. And then when I do calculate my average, it does a division of integers, which means technically it should be 4.8. But when I'm dividing two integers, this answer is an integer, and basically it drops all decimals. So I need to fix this, and one way to do this is to cast the different variables into floats. So let's go back to our calculate average function here. My calculate sum here is an integer, so I'm going to cast that into a float by just using the float in parentheses in front of it. And let's do the same thing for our number array there. And our average was declared as a float, so that should do it. So basically I'm taking this integer that was determined by the calculate sum, cast that into a float, do the same thing for the length of the array. Now I'm dividing a float by a float, therefore I'm going to get a float, and I should have my decimal point there. Let's test it out to make sure it works as expected. So generate the array. Let's figure out the total just to help us out. And there's our 4.5. If I were to find another array, I should get 5.3, etc., etc. So our button for our array, it just works. And that's it for that portion. Next, we're going to be working on the name functionality. What we're going to work on first for our name is going to allow the user to click on the submit button once something has been entered in the input field. To handle this, we're going to need to work with our update. And there's different ways to handle this, but right now what we want to do is use the update to keep it relatively simple. So let's go back to our script. I told you earlier we're not going to get rid of the update because we need it. And so what we're going to check is the content of the input field. So I'm going to have an if statement here, and I'm going to check the name input field dot text and see if it's equal to the empty string. I can just declare an empty string by opening and closing the quotation marks there. So if it's empty, I want the submit button to be not interactable, so I set interactable to false. Well, the other option is there is actually something in the input field, and in that case I can select my interactable property of the submit button and set that to true. Let's try this out, and technically it's going to test for this every single frame, which is not ideal, but it'll do for the purpose of this lab. If I were to enter something, it doesn't matter what it is. If I were to remove it, then the button becomes disabled or not interactable. As soon as I enter something, the button becomes available, etc., etc. So if I were to enter something here, I can click on the button. Now, of course, there's no functionality for that. That's our next step. Let's get back to our script. And let's create a function that will handle that. So I'm going to put it in between all my public functions called by buttons, and then before all of my private functions that are called locally. So public void on submit button click. So we're going to need to read the text that was entered in the input field. So I'm going to declare a string variable called name, and I'm going to read that from the name input field dot text. So I'm not sure if that will be a name per se or not. It depends on what the user has entered, but as long as something has been entered, the button was clicked, so I know there's something in that input field there. So that's great. I have the variable, but I kind of need to put it in my array. So the idea is, where in my array am I going to put it? Well, I have a variable that keeps track of the number of names that have been entered, and it's called the counter variable. If you remember, we declared it at the top of our script. It feels like it was a long time ago, but this is a class level variable, and we initialized it to 0. Well, wouldn't that be a perfect spot in the array, position 0 for the first name entered, for example? Yes, definitely it works. So let me go back to my function here. I'm going to use name array and then add position, well, of the counter. And I'm going to assign the name that was entered there. So far, so good. I have a name. Now, counter has changed, so I should do counter plus plus. Ooh, it's name counter. Sorry, I forgot about that. I just looked at it, and then I forgot. Name counter should go up by then, so I have one name entered. So the next thing is I want to check if I have reached the number of items here. So 0, 1, 2, 3 are going to be the index, but it'll go up to 4. So if my name counter is less than 4, so in that case I can update the text, count text dot text, and set that to be name counter plus 1, I guess, when we're expecting the next one. We'll see if that works out okay. Of 4. So what I want to do is, if I've entered 2 items, 2 names, then I want it to say 3 of 4. It's expecting 3, name number 3 out of 4 kind of thing. That's great. Also, I can reset the value that was entered in the name input field so that my user doesn't have to, and that should be name input field.text. Sorry about that. So the user doesn't have to delete the previous name to put a new one in. And then here also I'm going to check if the name counter is equal to 4. In that case, I need to make my submit button no longer interactable and set that to false. Now I may have some little issues to iron out with the values, but let's go test it out and see if that actually works. So I'm going to save my script, go back to the editor. Now I need to make sure I connect my submit button. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Select the game controller from the scene and then pick the function, which was on submit button click. Let's press play. So it says 0 of 4 because I haven't entered anything. Maybe I want to change that and to say 1 of 4. That would be a little bit better. So let's enter some names. Jack. Now it's expecting number 2. Notice how it's cleared the input field. Julia. Ashley. Misspelled that. And Robert. And once I've entered the 4th one, the button becomes unavailable because I can no longer enter names. The issue is then my print and sort buttons should become available. So we have a couple of things to fix here. The first one is I said at the beginning in the start when I set the text, it would be nice to use the same kind of counting. So if I do name counter +1, then let's make sure we do the same thing at the beginning so that it will be expecting the first out of 4, etc., etc. That works out a little bit nicer that way. And then the second item that I said we kind of needed to take a look at was with the name counter equals 4, submit button needs to be no longer interactable, but the print button needs to become interactable. So we need to set that to true. And the sort button also needs to become interactable. So we need to set that to true. Let's try it out and make sure that we have polished the couple of issues we noticed while testing the game. If I press play, there it goes. I can enter, now it says 1 of 4. It's expecting name 1 out of 4. So let's enter Joe. Let's enter Sam. John and Ashley. And I misspelled it again. There it goes, and now print and sort are available. Now, of course, they have no functionality, so nothing happens when I click on them, but they become available. That's great. Let's move on to the print and sort buttons. Going back to our script, let's take a look on how we displayed the number array. We had a function for that, and I have to find it. There it is. We declared a string to return, and then we did a for each loop to add the elements of the array in that string, and then we returned it. So we're going to do something similar to display our array. There is a slight difference there in the way that we're going to display the name array because we want to have each name on a separate line. In the way, if you remember in the worksheets, there were a couple that used this little asterisk display for displaying a rectangle, and we used the next line character there to go to the next line. We can do the exact same thing here for displaying our name array. So I'm going to go towards the bottom of my script before the closing curly brace for the class, and I'm going to create a function that will return a string, and I'm going to call it display name array. It's not really going to display it, but it's close enough. I'm going to declare a string to return. I'm going to set it to the empty string to get started, and then I'm going to return it. That makes the code a little bit easier. I don't see those red squiggly lines, and then it's already all set. All I have to do is change the value of my to return. We could use a for each loop, but for practice purposes, we're going to use a regular for loop. I'm going to use I for the index. I needs to be less than the length of the array, so this is the name array that we're dealing with. And then we can increment I by 1 for each iteration. And then I'm going to do to return is going to be equal to the name array at position I. And then I mentioned that I wanted to add that next line character. So if I remember correctly, it's this one. It does change color. So I used the correct one. A student taught me that. So there we have our string set up. I think it will look as expected. So next, let's call that function. Remember, because my function display name array is returning something, wherever I'm going to call it, I'm going to need to make sure to declare a string variable that will catch my return. That is a critical concept in value returning functions. So let's declare an event for our button, maybe right after the submit click button right here. This one, since it's an event connected to a button, it needs to be public, and it also needs to return void because the button has no way to handle a return from that function. And let's name it on print button click. So I need my open and close curly braces there. So I said if I want to call that function, I need to declare a string. I'm going to call it message, and then I'm going to call that display name array function. It'll return the string, and then that string needs to be displayed in the text, which I kind of forgot the name of it. So my text was named name text. And I can just display my message here. Okay, let's save it and test it. So I save my script, I go back to the editor, I make sure I am actually connecting my print button with the function I just created by selecting the game object, holding the script in the scene, that is important, and then finding the game controller script, and then on print button click. Let's press play. Now I do have to enter names. My names have been entered. I no longer have access to the submit button. Press print, and there are the names displaying here, exactly as I wanted them to be displayed. If I were to enter more names, the submit button will become available again. That's a bit of an issue there. So I'm going to have to figure this out so that once my counter is 4 or more, or just 4, I can no longer have access to the submit button. Okay, we'll modify that in a little bit. Let's work on our sort button first, and then we'll deal with that button coming back alive in this case here. So let's declare the event here. Very nice. I have my sort button click. So what I need to do is basically sort my name array and then display it. So it's really not a lot of work to do. If you may or may not remember that there are static methods available with arrays, and one of them is a sort method. So we're going to click array dot. All right, it's not allowing me to do array, so if you can't do array, then you want to go back to system.array. And then there's a sort method that will sort my array for me and will store back the information in the same array. So that's it. That's all I need to do. That has sorted my array. Then what I do need to do is update my text to display it so I can do a string message again and assign to it whatever the display name array function is returning. And then I think I've got a little typo here. Let's fix that quickly. And then I can display that in the name text. .text and display that message. All right, let's test it out and then we'll fix our mini bug. So I'll go here. I need to make sure that I connect my sort button to the function I just created, selecting from the scene the game controller, and then in the list of scripts select the game controller and find the unsort button. Click, press play, enter names, Jack, Rocky, Julia, and Beth. So I can print them to make sure that they are the names that I actually entered: Jack, Rocky, Julia, and Beth. And if I click on sort, I should see Beth, and then Jack, and then Julia, and then Rocky, and then I do. Actually, that's great. The only issue is here, if I were to enter George and click on submit, I'm getting some troubles here. We'll see what happened. How was that possible? Well, the issue is that my submit button should no longer become available. I went and the index out of range exception. That means my index was too big for my array. If I double click on the error, it'll take me to where I had an issue. And that makes sense. My counter was up to 5 at that point. And then if I tried to access, or actually was at 4. If I try to access position 4 in an array of 4 elements, of course, it's going to break the code. So I really have to work on not allowing that submit button to click again. Let's go back to the portion of the code that's enabling and disabling our submit button. You may have noticed that the script is getting kind of big. So what I could do is, to make it a little easier, I can double click on my variable there, and wherever submit button is in the code will be kind of like highlighted like this. It'll be easier to find it. That's one way. I can also do a Control F, and then here, because submit button was already selected, it'll iterate through, or it will loop through all of the submit buttons. So if I could go to the next one, and this is the portion in the update, that's exactly what I was looking for, where my submit button is enabled and disabled. And so every time my input field is empty, it's not interactable. But if I write something in my input field, then the button becomes interactable. I want it to become interactable when something is entered, but only if my name counter is less than 4. So I have a second condition here. Either I have my name input field is empty, in that case it's disabled, or I have the case where my name counter is less than 4, and in that case I can make it interactable. Otherwise, it'll be set to false. So else if name counter, I think it was the name of the variable, is less than 4, then I make it true. And then let's do one more case just to be thorough. If the submit button, if the input field is not empty and the name counter is not less than 4, then in that case I need to disable that button. Let's save this and test it out. Hopefully that will fix our little concern there. So I can test out by pressing play here in the editor. I can enter some names. I'm going to enter some very simple names just for the sake of saving time. I've entered this one. I could just sort them and all that. If I enter more names, nothing happens. My submit button is gone now. So we have solved our little bug alert issue. We have basically covered all of the requirements for the lab. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.